Greetings and peace, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today, I have the honor and privilege of being joined by my brother from the Fatimiyya Sufi order, Matt Douglas, who returns for part five in the series of dialogues and conversations that we're having. So, for part five, Brother Matt wants to talk about the global corporate evil and the hegemony that we're seeing across this planet. So, without further ado, Nur alaikum to my brother.
Alaikum, Salman. Glad to be on again. My throat's a bit scratchy, so sorry if my voice sounds a little off, but
Mm-hmm.
I'm okay. Um, yeah, well, I wanted to start with just something that's been in the news
Mm-hmm.
recently to make a little comment on that will kind of segue into the main theme. And I want to start off talking about these trucker protests that are going on.
Right.
I'm going to start with the one that's in Canada, where they are alleging it's against a vaccine mandate.
Mm-hmm.
Now, of course, that though being the thing they're protesting against, though, is kind of a false narrative, because in fact there isn't a vaccine mandate in Canada. There's a quarantine mandate if a cross-border trucker who is unvaccinated enters Canada. Now, what percentage of truckers are and are not vaccinated, I'm really not sure. But what's very strange is they're protesting against the government.
Right.
And it's not really the government's job to, or I should say, it is the government's job. I won't talk about what it isn't their job. I'll talk about what is their job.
Mm-hmm.
That it is their job to oversee public health and make laws and regulations accordingly to protect public health.
Mm-hmm.
We can argue, and in hindsight, we can perhaps see that things might have been good or bad decisions. They'll never be perfect. But it's, as far as what kind of mandates for vaccines and quarantines, et cetera, that's the government's job. Now, what these truckers are protesting is the fact that this is impacting their living. Well, if they choose not to get vaccinated, yeah,
Mm-hmm.
but that's a choice. That's not discrimination against someone for their ethnicity or skin tone or
Mm-hmm.
nationality or age or gender or whatever. It's about a choice they made.
Right.
And they chose not to get vaccinated.
That's absolutely right.
What is impacting then their lives? Because I think there's probably at least some testing and some probably additional checks that might be slowing down even the vaccinated folks, but a wee bit.
Mm-hmm.
If things are hard for truckers at this time due to less pay, due to various regulations for COVID,
Mm-hmm.
that the people to complain to and to protest against is not the government, but the corporations.
That's right.
But that's not being done here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, and we can look at this on both, on two angles. Number one, now this protest currently seems to be kind of at a standstill. We're not sure what's going to go down. It's still in the middle, but there was a successful trucker protest in Colorado just a little over a month ago.
Yeah, that's right.
Okay, and because, this is, I'll remind everybody, it's because, and I forget the guy's name, but a truck driver back in 2019 had his brakes fail after missing a runaway truck ramp on I-70 and ended up killing 4 people.
Hmm.
What came out over the course of the case was that, the safety standards of the truck were not up to snuff, which is the company's fault, their truck.
Mm-hmm.
And while the driver, whose truck killed 4 people, was inevitably scarred for life, and those 4 people aren't coming back, much of the protest blocking, trucks refusing to go into Colorado and, basically kind of block the entrance to the state summit, did result in about 10 days later, after this driver was given a sentence of 110 years, it was reduced to 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
So the protest was successful because, it got the guy's sentence reduced, saying that, hey, this wasn't all the driver's fault. It was the corporation's fault. So even though they went out, they went after the government for the sentence they passed. But with that was in mind, what was in mind during this protest was that even though they were going against the state for their decision and their verdict, it was very clear that the real folks at fault, even though whatever laws are in place kind of ended up protecting those who are really liable, the corporation.
Yes.
And now those stories, you're not hearing about this successful protest anymore. It seems to have disappeared. There's no comparisons being made to this new one that started in Canada.
That's a good point.
And the whole idea of, where is the corporate liability is gone from this.
Mm-hmm.
Is gone from this one. There's also situations, because when you and me talked about this, you mentioned about someone not getting to the hospital due to this blockade.
Yeah, that's right. There's a woman that lives in Canada, and the place where she goes to the hospital for herself and her sick mother has been blockaded by a lot of these people who are protesting the Canadian and Justin Trudeau government.
And how has that affected? You go into how that actually affected any.
Yeah. So what's been going on is like a lot of the places and corporate headquarters and a lot of the main office buildings, let's say where these places and services are located, the entrances and a lot of the roads are blockaded. So those that have to come in, they cannot travel by any means because everything is blocked.
So here we are in the middle of COVID, and the government's regulating that. People are protesting in such a way.
Yeah.
It's not only not going after the real bad guy, but it's essentially compounding the situation, because here you have hospitals in some areas. I don't know if in Ottawa specifically, but certainly
that's exactly it.
Where the hospitals are overcrowded, and now the medical care is stretched that much further, in the sense that, and on the effectiveness of the medical care system is reduced, because some people now have even less access to the hospitals than before, thanks to these trucker brigades. So again, it's a very ineffective protest at, where the real problem lies. And further, I want to comment that many of the road blocking protests that occurred in response to various murders by police in the U.S. were arranged in such a way that emergency vehicles were allowed to get through. whereas this does not seem to be the case with these protests at all.
Yeah, this is totally different. And, I thank you for bringing up the medical situation as well, because in my local area, Brother Matt, there's already 1 to 2 hospitals that have shut down because of the staff shortage due to COVID and so many other factors that this pandemic has brought into our weak system and its infrastructure.
Essentially, they're making the COVID situation that triggered their whole thing even worse. So it's misguided on the other level. In terms of it really not solving the problem. And I'm not saying the protest can't be used, it can't solve a problem, but these obviously aren't working. And they're certainly they're not putting their finger on the real problem. Whereas the one in Colorado did seem to put its finger much more on the problem. And yet, so many times similar events are compared to each other, and yet you hear no comparison in the media whatsoever between the one in Colorado and the one in Canada.
That's exactly it.
And further, what's just plain scary is that this style of protest is catching on, despite its obvious ineffectiveness in Canada. I've heard something going on in Australia, but I'm not too knowledgeable of that. But I can tell you here in Thailand, the same thing has happened in what I would say is an equally ludicrous way. What's happening is the truckers are trying to blockade around the Ministry of Energy's offices in Bangkok. And what they're protesting is the price of gas. Now, again, one has to ask, why the hell are they not going after the corporations?
Right.
But here's the thing, the government has already put some price ceilings on diesel fuel at 30 baht per liter, which is a little under $1. So gas prices, are not too much above what they were I'd say there may be about 10 or 20 cents more a gallon more than they were in the Philly area the last time I was there.
Yeah, now here, Brother Matt, you'd be surprised. Gas is $4, $4.50. It's getting close to $5 a gallon.
Okay, well, that's what it was in California when I was out there, right after my time in Pennsylvania.
Yes.
But okay, yeah. But okay, the ceiling that the government has imposed then in Thailand is cheaper. But what the protest is about is they feel that the 30 baht price ceiling is too high and they want it lowered down to 25. But catch this, you have truckers coming from all over Thailand. So you actually had truckers. I mean, there were some in some various articles, local articles I was reading, that some came as far as Chiang Mai.
Yeah.
Which is in the north over 400 miles from Bangkok. So in order to protest the price of gas, some truckers drove 400 miles and spending gas money on it. Now, it's well known with other forms of street protests that have gone on here that they were funded by groups like the National Endowment for Democracy and other groups wanting to, not happy with, foreign groups not happy with the government of Thailand for not kowtowing.
Yes.
To Western whims. Now it's not clear exactly who's behind this right now. It hasn't come out like who the instigators are and all that. But you gotta think that no one in their right mind is going to drive 400 miles paying for the gas of an 18-wheeler.
Right.
No, does not get good mileage at all. I mean, I think they get what, 4 or 5 miles per gallon. Is going to drive that distance, spending that kind of gas money to protest the price of gas. They say, when they're feeling it's essentially 20% too high, and they're gonna though spend enough to drive over 400 miles, 700 some kilometers to the protest. Doesn't make a lot of sense unless someone's paying them off.
That's exactly right.
And interestingly enough, now the main force in terms of the Thai spokesman who was encouraging this, although we could see it having a much greater Western origin, a lot of the previous protests, the Politico who was spurring most of it on was Kenaton Jingrungran Ki, who is he's a businessman turned politician, in his case, a rich kid who inherited his business, making him a businessman turned politician, who owns the largest auto parts manufacturer in Thailand.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, he's already tried to derail pun intended, derail a major project of building high-speed rail. Going connecting Bangkok to Vientiane, the Lao capital. Okay, by basically saying it should be done not by buying Chinese tech, which already has plenty of effective high-speed rail, but with the U.S. company called Hyperloop, which, of course, well, we both know there's no high-speed rail in the U.S. yet. So it's a questionable product, not to mention the fact that with Lao, having Chinese tech having built its railway with Chinese tech, there's no guarantee that the U.S. tech would be compatible.
Mm-hmm.
So if it was a matter of shipping goods or receiving shipments to Laos or China, no guarantee it's going to be smooth sailing on the track.
Yeah, that's right.
So so it's kind of common sense, but that by wanting to go with a different corporation, different tech, it's really just a smokescreen for a sabotage project.
That's absolutely right. Now, who do you believe, Brother Matt? I have a quick question. Now,
Yeah.
Who do you believe benefits from this Canada protest or these truckers' protest? What's been going on with these parallel comparisons, even in Thailand? Who's benefiting from this?
Well, I'm trying to. I mean, obviously, who's benefit? Well, in Thailand, you get a different situation, and I'm going to have to think and let's see what kind of an analysis I can do on the fly here. Now, in Thailand, it's a little more obvious as the protests are, Western funded. So it's obviously the West that is doing this for their own benefit, and the benefit they're getting, what the Western corporatocracy is doing, is essentially doing, when you get down to it, it's the exact same thing that the Brits did to the U.S. during the Civil War. Because the U.S. Civil War was fomented by British intelligence, and there was a reason for it. Okay, here you had the U.S. that gained a lot of its wealth through slavery. Mainly at that time, during the mid-1800s, the big cash crop was cotton.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are plenty of other, American products that went to Britain. That was the big one. Coal was another one. A lot of coal mines in Appalachia. And a lot of towns in the South that had rail going out to the coast was to ship things like coal from, the Appalachian Mountains,
Mm-hmm.
especially like Virginia. Um,
Right.
to ship coal and to ship cotton, to ship coal to the coal plants and cotton to the textile mills in Britain.
Mm-hmm.
And at that time, keep in mind, you just had the rails going to the coast, and then, because without the rail, the best mode of transportation fastest was ships. But all these rail lines initially were built, inland to the port.
Mm-hmm.
And the U.S. at that time, not that I'm defending them because they were racist too, and imperialist as
Yes.
well, but you had a drive in the U.S. to start building a lot of railroads connecting U.S. cities to other U.S. cities.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, which threatened the hell out of Britain because not only was the U.S. not dependent on trading, on having them be their buyer,
Yeah.
because ship inner city to inner city, but also what British ships were making money off of. Britain, being an island nation, they had a huge navy and merchant fleet. Even privatized. Various people in business privatized. Merchant ships who would run products up and down the U.S. coast. You start building rail. Okay, then the naval power and the merchant marine power now has to take a back seat to the railroad because the railroad's faster. So that's what's going on right now.
Thank you.
With China's building their rails and their Belt and Road Initiative. They're already one of the biggest factory nations, and they're trying to be the hub. Which also, if they can control the rail in Asia, then that prevents the U.S. from cutting off their fuel via warship through places like, say, the Straits of Malacca, and other various water routes. Because on land, if someone's on your land, then that's an invasion. You kick them off. But in the sea, where once you get past 7 miles and you're in international waters, theoretically under international law, despite all the aggressive appearances, it's still technically legal to sail a ship anywhere if it's not under international law, if it's not within 7 miles of the coastline.
Mm-hmm.
So that allows for a lot of ambushes at sea and things like that. So it would be there would be many choke points where the U.S. Navy or the U.K. Navy or whatever could cut off a shipment of oil to China.
What's interesting? I'm glad you bring this point up because I've seen in the next 5 to 10 years, especially now more than ever, brother Matt, the economic hub of the world shifting to Southeast Asia because that's where the majority of the Earth's population is in many ways. Also, much of the manufacturing and development and technology, computer chips, so many things that come in mind that are running the system today as we know it come from those territories. And I remember taking a macroeconomics course, and my professor was a retired American military officer. And he had said the same thing. This was in 2016 when I had him, that in the next 10 years, let's say from that time frame till 2026, that economic hub would really take place. And you're yourself have seen this with your own eyes as being in that part of the world and being in the West you see the big difference. And this UK-US hegemony, I see both of them basically as one entity instead of them being separate nations. Both of them kind of act as one entity for their own interests.
Yeah, well, what you have to keep in mind is, although, I mean, I'm not here to necessarily defend the U.S. government, for example, because I find them morally illegitimate, as Turtle Island rightfully belongs to the indigenous people.
Yes.
That said, okay, despite all the horrors of colonization and genocide, ultimately the ultimate baddie is not the governments, but it's the money powers behind them that buy them out.
Mm-hmm.
And ideally, a government is supposed to be what can protect the individual from the corporation.
Sure.
But unfortunately, in many cases, they often end up being just another layer of enforcement for the corporation.
Yes.
And if you look at if you look at the British Empire, that was the most murderous empire in history. It did it through it was the one who started doing it, unlike Rome, which just did it for the nation itself. Britain was the first to come along and corporatize it and privatize it. Okay, through the British East and West India companies. It was really the British Empire that started the mega corporation.
Mm-hmm.
And the British East India and West India companies were, you could say, the first mega corporations. Interestingly enough, a lot of people look at the U.S. as just a big corporation in some ways. If you look, there was one time I even sadly saw a house in Philly flying the flag, but the flag of the British East India Company looks very much like the American flag. I think there's only 11 stripes instead of 13, but I could be wrong about that. It could be a full 13, but I think it's just 11. But alternating red and white. But except where in the American flag you have the blue with the white stars, which grows as the number of states grow, you have the flag of Great Britain in that corner, in that left-hand corner. So it's very ironic that so many people consider the U.S. to be more of a giant corporation than a nation. How similar the U.S. flag is.
Yes.
To the flag of the British East India Company.
That's absolutely correct, because my home nation of Pakistan was part of that British Raj system before it split off into its own country for the Muslims. And as I see to this day, many of the leaders of Pakistan are still groomed from England. They're trained there, and they're sent to Pakistan to be leaders. So that power structure of them having their foreign policy and their people in charge that are trained and groomed by them is still very much in effect this very day in certain parts of the world.
Oh yeah, and certainly Pakistan's not the only nation, but I'm sure there's I would say I know you've done a podcast before on that fairly briefly, but there's probably, an hour or two podcast you could easily do on your own about all that history. But what this all underscores is just with these protests, not seeing where the real evil is coming from. This keeps happening on so many levels. You wonder if even, so in terms of who benefits, okay, we see that the West is benefiting by causing chaos all throughout Asia.
Yes.
Okay, and it's not, and I hate to say benefit, because it's not, when I say because it's only the elites who are benefiting so they can stay at the top. Whereas more trade that was done in a friendly way can benefit, with the right system, can benefit the whole world. Now, that's not to say that the RI automatically will, because you have to then consider what system is running it. As the saying goes, if it ain't available to the poor, it's neither radical nor revolutionary. but it's having having better trade, having easier access to whatever various minerals and materials and goods certainly is one of many steps towards creating a more prosperous future for all. You just need the right, in addition, it's just not enough on its own. You need the right system. And so we're seeing first, an effective protest in one area, Colorado, that at least did realize where the real trouble was coming from, even if they were limited in going after them, because it was really about getting this man's sentence reduced, which was a state decision. Yet now that seems to be totally obscured, blaming where you have truckers in multiple countries being organized by some force. It's hard to, because of where it's being, how ineffective the choice of target is. It's very hard to say that this is just all a simultaneously misguided grassroots effort. I mean, I could see I could see an occasional spurious, misguided thing, because so much is focused on governments that people often forget, that the power often is the corporation.
Yes.
But so you have to. I don't know fully who's driving this, but you got to scratch your head. It's like, okay, we got a protest at work. How do we do the same thing but make it not work?
That's right.
Which is select the wrong target. And this goes on multiple levels. For example, I mentioned the China's Belt and Road Initiative. And, I often get asked the question, like, well, what do you think of China? And, there's definitely mixed feelings there. Or they'll talk about, say, China and their relations with, say, Africa. Is it colonization? Well, nowhere near compared to what Europe did by a long shot. But does that mean it's perfect? Well, not necessarily. But again, people then are looking at China as a monolith, which isn't true, because in fact, a lot of these, development projects that China's doing are done by Chinese corporations. They might have some more or less sanctioned government, but obviously, if a Chinese private corporation strikes a deal with the government in another country, we'll say Africa, somewhere in Africa, some African nation, then the Communist Party of China is not in the same position to rein in the company as they would be with that same company operating within China. So so again, what you'd have to do is take a look at how that particular company is handling that particular project to decide how, beneficial or malicious it is. And I think the Chinese government has done some pretty good within China about reining in corporations, and at the risk of saying it in a nasty way, I'll give them credit for the fact that, billionaires can get executed there if, their corporate decisions lead to loss of life, which doesn't happen, in places like the US and UK. There's so many loopholes that always try to put it on, put the blame on the lowest rung.
Yeah.
Now, here in Thailand, it's a little more, it's kind of interesting in the fact that you have a government, the government in power, although the prime minister did win the last election. He had been in for 5 years because he took over, throwing out the prime minister who was a Wall Street puppet. And I've said that before in other podcasts.
Right.
So given the fact that a Wall Street puppet is going to be particularly friendly to big business, it's still nonetheless about, and I definitely think that, a military leader is going to be a little more pragmatic in seeing and being limited into what a foreign corporation can come in and do. I think it's a big fallacy to assume that the corporations are ever going to go to sleep and stop trying their machinations with the Thai government or any other government. While the Thai government has for years under various stripes of prime ministers, does have a pretty decent amount of laws that allow for small business to do better. Okay, Thailand is estimated to have the second biggest shadow economy in the world behind Nigeria. Basically, shadow economy meaning dollars in circulation that don't appear on the GDP.
Got it.
This is often in the form of, say, street vendors. Any Thai citizen, a foreigner, can't do it. But any Thai citizen can, either with the permission of the business they're in front of, or if not, with the permission, with an okay from the local police, can street vend.
Yes.
And it's tax free. A lot of businesses, if they're just run out of the home, I think some of those can be tax free, although that's a little more iffy. But there's a lot of, you being in Philly, I've driven around Philly enough to know you have things like little convenience stores or barbershops or something like that in like the bottom floor of a 3-story townhouse, and it's the business of the folks who own it and who live up above on floors 2 and 3.
Yep.
You have a lot more of that here in Thailand. So with things like that, it does give a lot more options for for very small business. But you have to wonder, when you have an opposition to the current government who's a sellout, what no one seems to think could be a danger is how would a neo-colonial puppet try to strip away all these opportunities for the small business to then boost the business of the bigger corporations. And it would probably be done under all kinds of concealed guises, such as, now the street vendors have to pass a health code. Sounds nice, but the thing is, this isn't a restaurant where somebody's cooking in the back. You can see what they're doing and you can judge for yourself.
Yeah.
So what happens if people that, if you have a country like Thailand where a government gets in, and granted they do have, ultimately they're overseen by a monarchy who can kick them out, so that can be a bit of a saving grace, potentially.
Mm.
Um, but now if you have if you have prime ministers in a cabinet who are friendly to Western corporations, there's very few places where street vending is legal in the U.S., at least not without a whole ton of permits and things like that.
It's nearly impossible with all the regulations and permits and
Yep.
fees and licenses they put you through.
Yep. Now there's a few places like in California, there's a few places where it's starting to come back, but it's pretty slim, So what happens if someone friendly to the West comes in and starts stripping away
Mm-hmm.
all those, then what happens is, okay, more people are then forced to buy from the restaurants, which may be chain restaurants owned by a foreign corporation, and some of that money is going out of the country, thus
That's
reducing
absolutely right.
the average income of the average, working class Thai.
It's interesting you bring that up because when I was in London, I saw that there are two Londons, one which is your regular London and one that is the City of London Corporation. And when I went there, it's built on top of Londinium, the Roman ruins, as they have an underground area where you could go see that. And I looked around and I saw these people dressed as Roman senators walking around looking like Romans. And basically, the financial power of the world is still dictated by those that run the City of London Corporation. And I kind
Oh,
of
sure.
realized that fact that we think that the real power is in DC or it's somewhere over here. This is like the military logistics in a way. That's why I say that the British and the American empires act as one entity now, where you have the City of London Corporation, you have the elements here, and together they are that Western global
Yes.
hegemony of white supremacy.
Yeah, I definitely agree. I mean, they might have differing roles. Let's say going on that, London mostly controls, the banking. The most
That's it.
notable family being Rothschild, of
Mm-hmm.
course, with maybe right, but there's many other families in that cartel. Plus, you also um still the most powerful family there is probably is Windsor, because technically they own the whole British Empire. Um,
Yeah. And brother Matt, they all the countries that were colonized by Britain, all the African countries, Asian countries, Pacific, Caribbean, even the Americas to this very day are still heavily influenced on by them. So on paper, all these nations are independent, but they're still heavily influenced by British intelligence and the British Empire. So technically they're still here, but hiding
yeah,
under a guise, which makes them easy to control and manage their empire rather than have people rebel against them.
yeah, and while the American system was somewhat different, it was more alike than different. It was still every bit as racist. Um,
Exactly.
and even then, what was very much the American, I mean, America really doesn't go by American system economics anymore. Not that that wasn't capitalistic, but it was kind of like the first regulated capitalism. But over the years, those regulations keep getting stripped away. Um, so you still, and you have maybe more military control and military power coming out of the U.S., but more of the financial power is still very much in London. Um,
Mm-hmm.
and Wall Street's really kind of like the City of London's kid brother.
That's absolutely right. And that's what I realized because people have to really travel and see the world in order for them to open their eyes. Majority of the people here in the States, they don't go outside of their small suburban towns or cities, and they end up growing up with the same people, intermarrying with each other, and their kids end up in the same cycle. So they don't really have that idea of what's really going on out there. And in my opinion, and from my observation, I believe that it's still the British Empire in effect today. They're still running everything financially. All of the leaders are still being groomed by them and being sent to these different nations that they still control to this very day with their intelligence and foreign policies. So that power is still very much there, and they're just gotten good at hiding it to, I guess, avoid
Oh
mutiny
yeah.
or rebellion from the people.
Yeah, or you might also say that they have a lot more satellite states.
Yes, exactly,
You
exactly.
know, and
Them
it's
and the
even
French.
it's just yeah, the French, you know, the Germans, the Russians, the whole bit. Um,
Yep.
you know, it's all, and whether you want to call it British or just call it white, it's all kind of the same thing.
It's still the
Um,
same hegemony.
yeah, exactly. Um, you know, and you have with the rise of China, you have something that's challenging that. Granted, it's challenging it more through capitalism, you know,
Hmm.
which is um and they are somewhat beating them at their own game.
Yes.
Now, will that be an over, you know, will it be an overall better world? Well, probably a little bit, but will it be
Hmm.
perfect? Not really, because there's, you know, capital will still be in control. Even if the CPC is good at reining it in within China, we've seen what happens.
Hmm.
You know, just the way, if you look, it was probably the closest thing to a socialist US, which is still really far from that, would be the FDR era.
Yeah.
Um, and even all those regulations, you know, that helped boost the American middle class have been slowly stripped away. And they're continuing
Hmm.
to be stripped away more and more. Um,
And that's absolutely right, because there is no middle class anymore. People can't survive. It's just so hard now with the inflation and expenses, and
oh
it's
yeah,
just not there anymore. With somebody could get married and have a family. I mean, now you go to the supermarket, you grab like two or three things, you're already at 65, $70, and that's unbelievable with the rent, the cost of living.
yep,
So, and these people at the top are just getting richer and richer.
yep. And so we have to always look in the, you know, and you know where, you know, where is this evil system coming from? And it's coming. It's not ultimately coming from the governments. It's
Hmm.
coming from the corporation, the
Yes.
oligarchs. Uh, Now, that's not to say that a small business is automatically not exploitative.
Hmm.
They certainly can be every bit as badly, just not to as many people. you know,
Hmm.
um, you know, if a restaurant is on, you know, in the U.S. is only paying somebody $2.35 an hour plus tips, it really doesn't matter if they're a mom and pop place or a chain.
That's it. That's pretty much it. That's you hit the nail right on the head.
Um, Now, in general, I would say there are more, um, in terms of the inequality between the owner slash CEO versus the average worker. Obviously, there's going to be more of an um, income difference in a corporation than in a mom and pop place, but that the it's still a bad situation for the worker.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, I see
you
it
know,
all the time. I going around these different places, the gas stations, the franchisee stores, so many different franchise and corporate names or brand names that you could see. The workers are 9.5 out of 10 being exploited, and
oh yeah,
they're not being paid enough. They're being worked to death, and they're not being treated as human beings. I mean, let's say they could have a perfect attendance for many months, working 5, 6 months straight, and they have one issue, and boom, they throw them right off the schedule, like some trash on the street. That's how they view their workers instead of viewing
yeah,
them as human beings, and it's so terrible. And I know all of these people will pay a spiritual price one day for what they did.
Yeah. Yeah. But even with that, I don't necessarily like the idea of letting karma take care of them in the end, because in the meantime, their victims continue to suffer.
Yes, that's
And
right.
the more important thing to me is not that everyone get their just desserts in the end, although that's something. But better to have a world with as little unnecessary suffering as possible, so that you don't have to worry about karma getting anybody.
That's it.
you know, um,
And that's a good point you bring up, brother Matt, because a lot of people have asked me this question: that what is fate and what is free will? And it reminds me of a verse from the Holy Quran where it says that God or Allah does not change the condition of a people unless they change it themselves. So people collectively come together and try to change a system. That's the only way that we will see some kind of change happen. What is your perspective on that?
well, because we use the word free will, and I know there's different meanings on that.
Yeah.
For example, I was talking to Wahid once, and he went against the idea of free will, but not in the way we normally think. He said, in terms of what we'd call choice, you still have it.
Yeah, yeah.
But he's talking about free will as being something that really only exists for Allah, because true free will would require omniscience to know what exactly would happen.
Yeah,
That's
that's a
not,
good point.
but so there's some debate over the term free will, and there's different ways to use it. But in terms of choice, yeah, you do have choice. Okay, and nobody fully controls your thoughts, even if there's a whole lot of stuff out there to manipulate them.
Mm-hmm.
And we certainly, it's certainly life's work of always trying to more and more free yourself from that manipulation.
Mm-hmm.
And none. Where was I going with this? But again, going to the subject of free will or choice or whatever, wherever you want to put it on the spectrum. Now, I don't think that someone with a gun to their head has free will.
Yeah, that's a good point.
You know, and there are a lot of things that might not exactly be a gun to the head, but are certainly going to push people to make a choice they'd rather not make.
Yes.
Okay, working a job you don't like. Sometimes even entering into a relationship you don't like, especially women.
Mm-hmm.
You know, most mamas are going to do what they got to do to feed their kids.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody talks about how people are always immigrating to countries like the US and the UK. But the thing is, most of those, these countries have more wealth because they took it from
That's
somewhere else.
exactly right. That's absolutely
Yeah.
right. And especially how the US, the UK, France, this evil triad and this conglomerate has plundered and raped and killed and pillaged the entire world. And that's exactly what it is. If there was true balance, then it would be the other way around. No person in their right mind would risk their lives to cross seas and borders and so many terrible conditions just to get their families to safety. There is something that's there, like war and other things that they have done, which has caused this.
Yeah. And well, also they've taken the loot, and people will do what they got to do to get it back. You know,
Yes.
if a mama thinks the only way to feed her kids is to sleep with the thief for a portion of what was stolen, they'll
Mm.
do it.
Yeah, that is the love and sacrifice of the mother. Only a parent can understand that.
Yeah. Um. So we have to look at, I mean, it kind of, it's a good kind of segue somewhat into um one of the things you see here in Thailand, and since I'll go ahead and broach a subject that always kind of looms over
Mm.
um, the perception of Thailand and much of the world, and that's people come here looking for wives and for prostitutes.
Yes.
Um, Now, and and you can now. I'm here in Thailand. I'm a single guy, so naturally, if I want to enter into a relationship, well, 99% odds it's going to be with a Thai woman.
Mm-hmm.
Um, in and of itself, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But just like with any, I don't have anything against an interracial relationship in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
But I think a huge, huge problem with entering into one with kind of a kumbaya attitude
Yes. That's right.
of, oh, well, love conquers all and it doesn't matter. No, 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 no. And it is a bit of a problem, and one thing that is, just on a personal level for me difficult is the fact that the majority of Thai women, overwhelming majority of Thai women who go for foreign guys, who have a thing for foreign guys, especially Western foreign guys, are ones who buy in to the Western propaganda.
That's exactly right.
Um, but you'll see if talking, it's very easy to see, just whatever random spot online. Various. I mean, I'm really not part of any expat um chat groups or anything anymore. I mean, I got a few invitations to a few of them, and it's mostly just they're mostly filled with racist assholes, and I just left. Um,
Mm.
but you'll see so much talk about, be careful of the Thai women who are gold diggers.
Mm.
And while that's true, keeping that, not all, but certainly there are some. But what these discussions lack is the greater context of, as I said before, how the West got its money. And even
Mm-hmm.
though Thailand wasn't colonized, it has always been the brunt of a neo-colonial onslaught, and it didn't get any money from colonizing anywhere else.
Mm-hmm.
So naturally, global South nations are going to have their share of women who look to marry the guys, who look to marry the colonizers
Mm-hmm.
as easy wealth. And to put all the moral ambiguity on these women and not on the white society, the white male patriarchal society itself, is just more of blame the victim white supremacy.
That's it. You hit the nail right on the head.
Um, even when it comes to prostitution.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if you're a single guy here, it's hard not to know what goes on, because even if you're not looking for it, it's going to come to you. Um, you'll go walking down to the beach by a bunch of massage parlors, and some of them, a lot of them do more than massage.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that I'll say that's, full credit, now, it's not a front. Okay, and yes, some of that stuff goes on, actually fairly often. But if you get offered more than a massage and you say no thanks, you'll still get a good massage.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, all the massages, Thailand's the home massage. They're proud of giving a good massage. You'll get that. Now, I'll say to anyone who comes, tip your masseur, because if it seems like, okay, you get a basic massage of an hour for $300, which is about $10. What it takes a little more time to find out, you got to ask a bit, find out a bit, is that the one giving the massage only gets 100 of that, and the shop gets 200.
Yeah, yeah.
So, you tip 200. That's still an hour of massage for about $16-17.
Can't beat that.
You still can't beat that, and if you do that, you've tripled
Mm-hmm.
what the masseur gets for that hour.
Mm-hmm.
Now, to the credit of Thailand, despite the prostitution being extremely common,
Mm-hmm.
it is very rarely pimped.
Right.
The women are in business for themselves, and I think that in and of itself is very good.
On the positive side.
Yes, but that does not mean that there's not capitalist exploitation that goes on.
Mm-hmm.
And most people, you have to, for understanding this, not go to either extreme of indulgence or avoidance.
Mm-hmm.
Which is what most people, I think, fall into. Either, they're going just for that, or they're like, ew, and, just kind of, and you have, let's look at this from an economic level, regardless of what a person's individual morality is. Let's see what's actually going on. And like I said, oftentimes you'll get an offer for more because, a massage lady is not getting paid very much.
Yeah. And they have to
So
find some way to make their ends meet.
Right. Now, granted, okay, oftentimes their expenses are very low. And a lot of places, will have a decent camaraderie, and sometimes, many times the boss is nice enough to let them because, you're getting massaged on what is essentially a cot or a bed or something like that. We'll let them crash in the shop. Sometimes the boss, to save money, him or herself, will do the same to keep their living expenses down.
Mm-hmm.
But nonetheless, there is still sometimes exploitation that occurs. Sometimes fairly often, there will be, despite the fact that, a masseur is paid only on commission, as I mentioned, they'll still be expected to help, help clean the shop or do like some of the laundry. Because that builds up, changing sheets and things like that. That builds up. If you're doing a lot of massages, obviously it's More important now to be very thorough about that due to COVID.
Yeah.
They're expected
Indeed.
to
Indeed.
pay. And even if they're getting a free stay at the shop, the amount of labor they're doing is, the free bed for the nights is not worth as much as they would be getting paid.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Same thing with what's called the bar, the other main venue for it, the bars. Okay. So, oftentimes it's called a bar girl, which is basically not all of them are sex workers, although most are.
Mm.
They'll be allowed to kind of subcontract with the bar, so to speak, where they get a guy to buy him a drink at a substantial markup. The thing is, only some of that if you start asking around, only some of that markup goes to the girl, the lady. What would be a 40 or 50 baht drink for you is 150 to 170 if you buy it for them.
Oh, okay. I see what's going on here.
But the thing is, their commission on it, because granted, if the bar is calculating 40 or 50 for you to buy it, that means that they're selling it at a profit.
That's right.
They're marking it up, and they'll mark it up to 150, 170 baht. Not all of that commission goes to the lady. Usually it's 50 baht at the most. So a greater percentage of that markup goes to the bar. So even though many of these are small businesses, when I say that you can be a small business and still be very exploitive, there's a big example right there.
That's pretty much it.
And I do know, I know women who have helped renovate bars when, doing like, spackling or painting or something like that, helped renovate a bar and not get paid for it. Clean up, not get paid for it. I've known some, and even though some of these bars will have drinks that are non-alcoholic, so she doesn't get too sloshed working, that's not all. And I do know I know one woman who had a stroke because of alcohol consumption. And
you're right.
That takes a toll. And even if they're buying the non-alcoholic stuff, it's not like that's super healthy. You're packing away, having to pack away 8 to 10 of those a night to keep up appearances. Not good. So there's, and again, it's the bar who's making more of a profit than the worker. And if you look at labor increasing the value of a product, in the sense that, a worker takes raw materials and say builds a chair, you can at least in that, although it's the worker who has increased the value, you can at least give the factory a little credit for like the power bill. Probably not more than 5 or 10% of that increased value, but there's a little something there. Whereas in situations with this sort of bar arrangement, the lady is 100% responsible for the increased value of the product.
That's right. That's absolutely right.
and still gets less than 50%
Mm-hmm.
of that markup. So if you want to talk exploitation,
Yeah, it's interesting, brother Matt, and I really thank you for this part five that you have done in terms of this global corporate hegemony and evil that we're seeing of Western white supremacy and its hegemony over the world. Now, what closing thoughts can you give us before we do a part six in the future?
well, I mean, I wasn't even done. I had plenty of more stuff to talk about. How are you on time?
Oh, please take your time if you're not finished yet.
Oh, okay, because I was just, I'm just going from subject to subject here,
Mm-hmm.
I
Yeah,
figured I'd
please
touch
take your
on some
time if there's anything else.
Yeah, no, I got plenty more to go on. And I'll
Perfect,
kind of
perfect.
segue into some other stuff. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so again, how and I'd say this to the people, who do, because it is a really, Thailand is a really nice place to go. People are very friendly.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and in itself, not I don't think in and of itself, nothing wrong with being a foreigner who marries a Thai. Uh, Sadly, there's an extreme imbalance where it's almost always the man who's the foreigner and the woman who's the Thai. Um, in and of itself, nothing wrong with that, but to me, I think you have to have a greater level of responsibility. Even if you come here and are able to start a business or have a job, I think it's very important to consider what you're doing, not just for your significant other, but what you're doing for people in general.
Indeed.
Because no relationship exists in a vacuum. Okay, you
Mm-hmm.
come here, you start a small business, let's say a restaurant. Okay, and that makes good money, which you probably need to have your Thai spouse sign for because it's expensive if you don't. So pretty much has to be in their name. Um, but you could, together as a couple, you might make a lot of money, for one restaurant potentially. And that might look great to her, and she's got a better life economically than she thought she would have had, perhaps. But what happens if you're paying your cooks and your waitresses as low as you can?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you've helped one person, but maybe at the cost of, other people who, you're exploiting, and how much business are you then taking away, from other businesses, from street vendors. So to me, I'm looking at, I want to find the ways to do it in a way that, everybody's an equal. And I think it's just unethical and even immoral to
That's
really approach
absolutely
it.
right.
Um, because then you're still contributing to money being funneled to a select few, even if on a micro rather than a macro level.
This is great, brother Matt, and I'm really enjoying everything that you're sharing with us. Now, how can you basically, let's say, show the connection between the American, British, and French conglomerates that are basically all in one and the same, as far as I'm concerned, in terms of the global white supremacy hegemony? So, in your words and in your thoughts and analysis, traveling the world, what have you been able to pick up on your travels? And please take your time.
Whoa, I mean, I could go a long way with that. Some of it. I'm certainly not the first person to say this by any
Mm-hmm.
stretch, but the Western corporatocracy has just the most insidious and sleaziest propaganda machine that has ever existed.
Mm.
Since I'm talking about things like small business versus corporations, when I was a teacher, now keep in mind here, you have all kinds. If you want fried chicken here, for example, you can get it off all kinds of street vendors, and it's good, especially if you go down like way south to Hat Yai,
Mm-hmm.
where their style of fried chicken is well known throughout Thailand. But nonetheless, when I was a teacher here, I asked the question to, this is to what are the equivalent of 11 and 12th graders, probably a total of over 300. Like if you could meet any famous person who's now dead, as if they could come back for an hour for you to talk to, who would it be? And out of that, I got only two or three. But I got two or three people, I think there was three, who said Colonel Sanders. And, it's like, there are so, you can get better fried chicken from most street vendors, but you get Thai kids wanting to meet Colonel Sanders just because there's all this glitz and advertising around, around American corporations, in this case KFC. But you could go, there are all kinds of restaurants here. There are, and you see this there's advertising everywhere here, just like there is in the States.
Most people don't know they're glamorizing Colonel Sanders, but most people don't know that he was a monarch mind control handler.
Oh, really? I
Yeah,
did
so
not know.
that's so they don't know sometimes these people that are glamorized and shown as these benevolent figures. Yep, you got to look into them, see who they really are.
Yeah, well, it's funny because often people talk about the free market,
Mm-hmm.
which is a bunch of bullshit. Okay, because you don't go to a market and get anything for free. We all know that.
Indeed, indeed.
Yeah, it's their way of saying an unregulated market. But it's funny that you get these people who talk about just let the market do its thing. We talk about market. I was just talking, people talk about market forces. Market forces are people who buy stuff. Well, it's funny is they talk about, just let the market do its thing, don't interfere. Well, if you're truly into the idea of not interfering
Mm-hmm.
and even having government see to it that there is no interference in the market, then there should be no advertising.
Mm-hmm.
Because what is advertising if not an attempt to manipulate the market by
There it
getting people to buy
is.
it instead of someone else's?
And look how many millions and billions of dollars that they spend on these Super Bowl ads. Like they're
Yep.
so concerned about COVID, but America, imagine if they shut down the Super Bowl. The people in this country who can't live without their alcohol and ball games would riot because that's how much under control that they are.
Yep. But yet they don't riot, they, and going back to like, you would have mass protest and riot. And we're seeing this, these privileged truckers
Mm-hmm.
whining and these protests, and yet, you never had people, you didn't have people, in Canada, for example, you never had people gathering and protesting, all the disappearance of Native women.
And speaking of Native people, brother Matt, that's a great point you bring up. One of my friends I was talking to, he said that he finds it ironic that the same white supremacy that came to these indigenous lands like Canada, the Americas, and different parts of the world, and they gave these smallpox infected blankets and biowarfare, they eliminated so many of these people. Now the karma is coming back to them when they refuse to cooperate with the medical system, and so many of them are dying off from COVID.
That's true. And, North America and Europe have been hit the hardest.
Mm-hmm.
And while there is some karmic element at the same time, oftentimes the colonized communities within those areas are every bit as much affected.
Yes, yes.
Now granted, as a whole, like, Africa, especially, and Asia have done much, much better per capita.
Mm-hmm.
But the African neighborhoods, the indigenous neighborhoods, which would include Chicano, they're being hit hard.
Yeah, that's
So,
absolutely right.
um, yeah, there's definitely a component of the racism coming back on people, but a lot of the colonized in proximity are getting hit every bit as bad.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but there's the propaganda here to the point. Also another thing I've been thinking about. I was talking to a Thai friend about this recently. Um, there is Western propaganda here, just like there is, in the States, in all the, in all the white areas of the world. That is every bit as much what I'll call the Joseph Goebbels playbook, here as there is anywhere else. By that, I'm of course referring to, Hitler's right-hand man, who was, basically the propaganda minister. And, he's known for saying, I forget the exact quote, but if you want people to buy a lie, just keep telling it. And eventually people accept it as the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And you see that going on here by, by the neocolonials. I mean, because I was teaching in areas that are heavily under that kind of influence, where those folks are pretty popular. And, one of the big complaints they had about the government was that the government doesn't develop the country. And, well, here's the thing. Just in like the particular town I was in, Royette, I lived really near a canal, and it was kind of like what would have probably been the mode of the old city way back in the day. When it had a wall,
Mm-hmm.
most likely there probably were some walls at one point. A few Thai cities like Chiang Mai, where I recently visited, you still see sections of the old wall. The city's expanded way beyond it, but Royat just had the old canal. It's kind of in a not quite square shape, and because the city's expanded, since you got bridges over the canal, and I lived really near one. Lived on on the outside of the old city, but barely. And of course, a lot of the grocery stores were were what would be inside the old city. And while I was there, the bridge that was nearest to me was under construction, but it was renovated and the new, torn down and rebuilt all within about maybe 4 or 5 months. And during a lot of that time, there were like, little alternate structures set up that I could walk across. But in about 4 or 5 months, it was completed. And I'm thinking back to when I lived in San Diego, where one particular overpass, just east of Park Boulevard, trying to remember which street, San Diegans will know which one I'm talking about, where there was a certain kind of like overpass type construction, and just kind of not on a highway, just on like, basic city streets. That took like 2 or 3 years. Since I first came here 4 years ago, Bangkok has completely new metro lines. When you ride the bus from Bangkok to Pahin, you can see the new overhead rail systems they're starting to construct, and you see progress regularly being done.
Mm-hmm.
Khon Kaen, where I live, had their rails totally revamped, a new train station that was elevated rather than ground level. And you can still see the old ground level tracks very near the new ones. The road from Chiang Mai to Chiang Rai, which, 2 major cities in the north, has been completely renovated over the last 2 years. I know, because I've been on it, recently and about 2 years ago. Yet nonetheless, you have all kinds of people complaining that there's no infrastructure development. And it comes from some of these neocolonial talking heads. Oh, the government's not building anything. Whereas you can see with your very eyes that things are being built.
Right.
But people wanting a target will blame the government. Even if the government's, in this case, totally not guilty of what they're being accused of. And that's not to say that government, the government's perfect, no government is. But the way that misdirects people, you compare about how much that impacts people versus how much an exploitive boss impacts people, which is, much more, even if maybe on a very small scale, for some, and it becomes a big distraction. It's this kind of propaganda, I'm realizing, not only serves the purpose of pouring gasoline on a conflict between two factions so that the West can reap the spoils.
Yeah.
But it also takes focus on all the various exploitive corporations, large and small. The world's complicated. There's a lot of facets to it. And the corporations want to put all the blame on the government, even though the government's often there, in some cases, is their proxy. It's a distraction as to where, the real problems tend to be. And you see that here, every bit as much as anywhere else, and people fall for it. It's almost like there's no end to the levels of insidiousness you get from this propaganda. And it acts on multiple levels.
Yes.
But I had kids just eating it up and quoting it back to me. And I'm like, not exactly. That was the tough thing about being.
Thankfully you're there as an educator to teach them from right from wrong. I mean, here, even
Yeah.
in the States, the education system is so outdated. I mean, it's just not compatible with the modern world anymore.
Neither is Thailand, really, although the Thai education system is really just a copy of the Western one, which in a way kind of screws the kids up more because it's not culturally compatible.
That's right.
Because a lot of the kids would, make complaints about the school system, and it sounded a lot like the complaints I had. So now it's definitely harsher from the Thai kids, and I'm like, well, this doesn't seem to to mesh with so much I've observed about Thai culture. What's going on? Is this like the shadow side coming out? And then I realized, wait a minute, no, it's not that. It's not that the Thai school system is like the Western school system. The Thai school system is the Western school system.
Mm-hmm.
But of course, the kids don't see it that way, and it's one more thing to complain about the government for, and miss and totally be blinded to corporate exploitation. And really, when you talk about me being here as an educator, now I can't, with my new visa, I can't be a teacher for a while, but that doesn't, for a job, doesn't mean I can't be a teacher. Just means I got to volunteer. Or just just have casual conversations, things like that.
Yeah.
But one of the really tough things that I ran into, because I could recognize Western propaganda that they had suckered for whenever it came up. At least most of the time, Western propaganda is so deep. I won't say I caught all of it, but there was so much of it that it's like I didn't have time to refute the majority of it. They say every little bit helps, and I certainly try to do what I can, but it's like there's so much more I never felt like I had time to refute.
I think, Brother Matt, this would be a good segue into part 6, as we're at the 1 hour and 30-minute markup. So we will continue this in part 6.
Okay, I was gonna try and veer off a little bit for part 6. Maybe I'll try and amalgamate, because I don't know if I have a full hour and a half or even an hour left on this, but I agree that it is kind of, we need to wind this down. I think we got a pretty good one.
Yeah, so to make it easily digestible for the viewer.
For part 6, and maybe there's a little way I can kind of put it all together. I guess kind of some of my final thoughts would be, again, the importance, being the communist that I am, not that I want to give Marx full credit for that, even though he's kind of the main name, because so many indigenous societies lived in a very communal way thousands of years beforehand. Marx talked very little about the relations between government and citizens compared to the relations between worker and boss.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately it's about, seize the means of production. It's, so much capitalism is so pervasive and so common that people mistake capitalism with commerce itself. Every society is commerce, is trade.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? That's not capitalism. Capitalism is the workers getting very, very limited, if not outright zero, benefit from that trade, where people who quote unquote own, whatever that means,
Mm-hmm.
getting all the benefit while most people work tirelessly for very little. Getting into the government
Right.
is when we get into socialism, and that's been seen as a road to communism.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not the same. It's not the same thing. Ultimately, it's about it's not about a state delegating everything, but it's about the workers getting to truly reap the benefits of their hard work. And the idea that we really don't need to work that hard if we're truly reaping the benefits of what we do.
Got it.
And the people left over to take care of the needy who can't do so much work.
Mm-hmm.
That's what it really comes down to. And there's only so much a government can do to fix that. Now, reforming government is essential. It's an essential part of that, but nobody got the right to vote by voting for it. It's going to take more than just electing the right people, especially when your choice in elections, in the U.S., for example, is between two corporate proxies.
Mm-hmm.
Where one's subtly racist and one's overtly racist.
Mm-hmm.
It's really not much of a choice. Here in Thailand, there is more of a genuine struggle. There's a little bit more of a choice, but it's not perfect. I do support the current government because they are opposed to the neocolonials and want to keep Thailand Thai. Even though some of the neocolonials might have on some of the more wedge issues, I might agree with them, on some things, but ultimately, the economic sovereignty is the key issue that makes the others secondary. I'm not saying things are perfect. If anything, I tend to side. The analogy I like to use is this. Many Thais seem to get frustrated with the government for what they feel is kind of being arrogant and not listening to them. And to some extent, that is true. People got a point. But it's kind of like the overprotective parent versus the predator.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing that I do think is a mistake that the government makes is kind of wanting to say, just trust us and don't worry, we'll take care of it and we'll move on, and greatly underestimates the power of propaganda of the West, and therefore the people continue to eat it up. just, because they won't talk about it, just the way an overprotective parent, um, in the domain of sex, will think that they can protect their kids by not teaching them about it, when in fact it drives the kids to someone who will talk to them about it, who is usually a predator.
That's right.
Um, so it's gonna take some big conversations here.
Well, Brother Matt, I thank you so much. And part five was truly beautiful. It was a very much needed conversation about the global corporate evil structure that we're dealing with, not only in America, but different parts of the world, of this hegemony of white supremacy that's still in place, that's still affecting many people. And I thank you again, my brother, and I hope the viewers were able to take away something from this as well. Until part six, thank you again, and Nur alaikum.
Nur alaikum, brother.